Hello and welcome to Sunday. Oh my goodness, we are getting down to it. Okay, so today's chapter is Breakout. That's the beginning of the big fight. Then we have Melting Pot, chapter 50. That's the end of the big fight. Then we have, so just letting you know, it's going to be split up today. Um, Monster Mash is coming up after that, and that is kind of the after chapter, and it's very short. And then, of course, we have Epilogue, which should leave you hopefully looking for book four, and that's also very short. So that's what's coming up. So we're getting down to it. Beta reading is going fantastic. We've been getting tons and tons of feedback, and I have been scrambling to stay ahead of everybody, but it is happening, and the show is on the road. So I don't really have any ETA yet. It seems like every time I turn around, we're seeing more stuff, more edits, more everything. I still got to get front matter and back matter done, and the intros and all that good stuff. But anyway, it's coming along, and hopefully soon. Okay. Anyway, all right. Chapter 49, Breakout. My bliss was destroyed when Carl and Marius came back. I guess they didn't have the grace to die while attacking Perry and his rotten mages. Marius was buzzing with energy again, and Carl was even larger than when he'd left. Trailing behind them were 14 captured mages, every one of them stuffed full of magic and rotten to the core. I fired up the suck balls again, and the granny godmothers flew into action. It wasn't long before the air was filled with a lovely smell of rancid magic. The grannies cleaned, and Penny continued to fill up with neutral magic. I had about 3 feet of tunnel left to dig, so my escape was getting close. I was back to being busy again as I repaired the soul creations that needed it, refilled the ones that were nearly empty, and made new ones to keep the balance. This was turning out to be quite the task, as I had about 1,000 granny godmothers, 1,000 ass blasters, and at least 5,000 miners, not to mention all the new suck balls I needed to create as the old ones pulled their magic and then expired. T, I called. I'm getting close to getting out of here. Let's bring my body back to normal and get it ready for action. That process has already started, he reported. Remember, you'll need to start eating and drinking a lot more. Will do, I replied cheerfully. Carl got all the captured mages lined up on one wall, and then he sat on his cot and worked on packing in more magic for Marius. All the extra power seemed to be taking a toll. Carl was no longer able to just sit calmly and stare off into space. Now he fidgeted a lot, bouncing his knees up and down and shifting all the time. Several times he got up to pace the room. Marius couldn't sit still either, and he was too twitchy to do his normal seduction routine. So he just decided to have an orgy and bang as many of the rotten mages as he could. I don't know what had happened in their battle, but most of the mages were bursting with power and twitchy as well. They seemed to welcome the distraction, so the orgy was very vigorous and went on for quite some time. I felt like I was watching one of those old porn movies where all the actors just go at it in the last scene. I could see Carl visibly growing as he worked, and it only took a couple hours before his overalls finally gave up and just snapped. The seams ruptured, and Carl was left with pieces of denim hanging on him. He really did look like the Incredible Hulk. He was now as tall as John, about 7 feet, and bursting with muscles. I couldn't imagine how powerful he was going to be after draining all of these mages. Carl ripped off the rest of his denim and became naked just like everyone else. He sat, twitched, paced, and even did some push-ups. At some point, Carl had stopped pulling power from Marius, but he still couldn't seem to calm down. What he should have done was not pull any more magic until he'd fully processed what he had already. Instead, he slowly crotch-drained one of the rotten mages. I secretly hoped Carl would explode from the overdose of magic and energy, but he didn't. Carl hadn't joined in the orgy, and I was beginning to think that maybe he couldn't. Maybe he had to have this transfer of power before he got his rocks off. I don't know for sure, and I didn't really care as I was getting out of here soon. I guess the rotten mages were like potato chips, as Carl couldn't eat just one. After the first mage crumbled to dust, he paced for a while, then started on the next one, then the next one, and the next. Before I knew it, he'd eaten them all. He was now 8.5 feet tall, and he'd probably make John look small if they stood side by side. I'd been digging the whole time, and I had less than a foot left to go. I'd eaten a lot of transmuted food to bring my energy back, and tea had turned on the shivers for a while. I wasn't feeling 100%, but I could at least move. With all the snacks gone and the orgy over, Carl and Marius decided to lay down and get some sleep. I was ecstatic. This was it. This was working out perfectly. I'd finish the tunnel, crawl out, drop the stone slabs on their heads, and escape. I couldn't believe how well everything was going. Now the moment was almost here. Time seemed to slow down to a crawl. Carl and Marius both tossed and turned, unable to fall into a deep sleep. After a bit, Carl got up and paced for a while before going back to bed again. That made me nervous as hell. What if he decided to get up again, just as I dropped the ceiling on him? That would ruin everything. I had about 6 inches of tunnel left when Carl and Marius both got out of bed. Damn. They both talked for a moment, and then Marius left. What was up? They couldn't sleep, so they decided to go ahead and launch their plan, Penny said. Plan? What plan? I asked. I know Carl has specific ideas for fighting everyone at the house, but I haven't heard of any sort of grand plan. I haven't either, Penny replied nervously. I wish I knew what they were up to. Me too, I said anxiously. Carl folded the cots and moved them up against the wall. Then he used his magic to gather all the dust from the mages and swept that against the wall too. The place was pretty bare, but there was still a crate with food and candy bars in it. Carl picked up his denim rags and the little bit of trash on the floor and stuffed that in the crate too. Then he moved it to the back corner. It was almost like he was cleaning up a bit and getting ready for company. I had 4 inches of tunnel left when Marius showed back up, trailing 4 mages behind him. They weren't rotten mages and they didn't look powerful at all. If anything, they seemed like normal, anxious people. They were apprehensive coming in, but they looked really frightened when they saw Carl. Most of them started to back away, but Carl quickly put a stop to that. He made them come in and sit down on the floor by the side wall. He spoke to them for a moment, answered a few questions, and then went back to pacing the room again. Even though I was close to the surface, I still couldn't understand what he was saying, and Penny had to fill me in. These are some of the Louisville mages, Penny informed me. They weren't part of Isabel's inner circle, and they seemed to be the closest thing to the leadership remaining. Marius invited them here under the pretext of rebuilding the Louisville group. Carl just informed them that he will be the new leader of the Louisville mages, and he will accept their oaths shortly. So these mages are not oath-bound already, I asked. I don't think so, Penny replied. I think Carl wants them to vote him into office. I guess he thinks it makes it more official that way. That doesn't make any sense, I replied. This isn't a democratic process. He's the only candidate, and I'm sure they're scared to death of him. Plus, he's going to extract some sort of oath anyway. I think you're trying to apply a logic to someone who doesn't share your view of the world, Aggie said. I think you'd be better thinking of this as a boy playing make-believe with his toys. He probably saw all the glory that came to Isabel as a leader, and now he wants that too. So they will have a vote, he will be a leader, and they will do whatever he says, just like good little toys. If they don't, he will smash them and get new toys. Aggie's assessment felt spot on. I'd been so focused on him wanting to destroy our house that I'd forgotten he also wanted to be the leader of the Louisville Mages. Now it looked like his dream was going to come true. Nothing was actually happening, though, so I guess they were waiting on more people. I had about 2 inches of tunnel left when Carl showed up, leading Josette, the mage with the black aura. I didn't know who I was more shocked to see, Josette or Ken. Josette's puffy eyes and wet cheeks showed sheep and crying, but her head was up and her shoulders were back. She looked like a strong maiden about to be sacrificed. It was like she knew this was the end, but she was determined not to let them see her cry. My heart went out to her. I knew how scared she was of Carl, and she'd said she would never swear to him. Now that resolve was going to be tested. Ken, on the other hand, looked terrible. It looked like he hadn't slept, eaten, or bathed in days. His cheeks were gaunt, and he had a ratty looking beard now. His eyes were the biggest change, though. Before, they had looked kind and commanding. Now they were haunted, like he'd seen and done things he could never forget. At Carl's command, he led Josette over to stand with the other four mages. I thought everything would get started, as though Josette was the organizational mastermind of the Louisville mages, but instead, Carl spoke to Ken and then waited. Any idea what's going on now? I asked Penny. She just shook her head. I waited, my miners dug, and then Sandy stepped into the room. I almost couldn't believe my magic sight. Sandy was here. She moved forward a bit, and John moved into the room, followed by Tyler, followed by Annabeth. OMG, my crew was here, and I wasn't ready to go. Go, I commanded my miners. Go, go, go. We have to break through. I have to get out of here. I jumped into my physical space and crawled as close to the exit as possible. I felt so many things, I wasn't sure how to react. On one hand, I felt relief. I was saved. My rescuers were here. Everything was going to be all right now. On the other hand, I felt so scared. If they'd shown up a few days ago, I knew they could have kicked Carl's butt. But now he was 8.5 feet tall. He'd been cramming stolen magic into his body for days. He'd just successfully beaten 2 groups of powerful mages. I loved my home team, but I wasn't sure we were going to be enough. Penny, let me know exactly what they're saying, I commanded. She nodded. For a moment, the two sides just looked at each other. I'm sure my team was trying to adjust to facing off against a huge, naked Hulk Carl. This was Carl's moment to shine, so he just struck a pose and let them look. I think I'm overdressed, Sandy said lightly. I didn't know we were attending a birthday suit party, Tyler continued. And here, I thought the full moon wasn't until next week, John rumbled. They all laughed and then looked at Annabeth. She just shrugged. I got nothing, she admitted. You guys are the punny ones. They spoke casually, but the way they stood showed they were ready to fight. This whole place could explode with action at any moment. Marius moved to the back corner with the food crate, and the 5 Louisville mages huddled against the side wall. Carl backed up a bit until he stood beside the sucker circle. Then he looked around, centering himself in the room. We all know why we're here, Carl, Sandy continued, so let's clear the room, and then we can settle our differences. She motioned to the Louisville mages and indicated they should come to her. Hold up there, Sandy, Carl commanded. These lovely mages are my guests, just as you are, and they will stay here until our business is concluded. We're your guest? Sandy sounded surprised. Of course, Carl nodded. It was easy to keep an eye on you. I know where you live, after all. It only made sense that Josette would ask for your help once the other mage groups fell. Josette and I have our differences, after all, and she's made no secret how she feels about me. I'm sure the last thing she wanted was for me to win our little mage war. And then, since you invited us here, I'm claiming guest rights for myself, my house, and these mages. She gestured to the 5 mages cowered against the wall. According to the ancient traditions, that means we shed no blood and cause no harm while in your home. We can have a nice chat and then be on our way. Sandy stood proud and firm, like she was noble born. Then she looked around the empty space. Now, where are the snacks? I could use something to nibble on. I thought Carl would give an evil laugh and come back with a witty response. Instead, he seemed a little lost. I guess he thought they would see his powerful body and cower in fear, or maybe just attack immediately. I felt like the one thing he wasn't prepared for was a little banter. I think you misunderstand me, he said finally. You're my guest the way a fly has lunch with a spider, or a cat has a mouse over for dinner. Sandy and John exchanged glances. So you're going to eat us? Sandy asked. I'm going to eat them. He pointed at Tyler and Annabeth. You two, however, killed Isabel. For that, I'm not going to eat you right away. Instead, I'm going to play with you first. He gave a weird little laugh. And by play with you, I mean I'm going to torture both of you until you wish for death. Then I'm going to deny you your release. I'm going to heal you up and then torture you again. He leaned forward into anticipation. This is what he wanted to talk about. He wanted Sandy and John to quake in fear. Instead, Sandy waved her hand at him like she'd heard all this already and wanted him to hurry up. Yes, yes, that's what I figured. I'm sure you want to tell us all about it. You've been storing this up, so I'm sure it will take a while. Annabeth, why don't you take those nice mages out of here while we're having our discussion? This really isn't something they should be hearing. Good idea, Annabeth said brightly. She went over and grabbed Josette's arm as well as one of the other mages and started leading them to the exit. That was a ballsy move on their part, as Carl already said they couldn't leave. On the other hand, what was he going to do? Kill him? Stop right there, Carl snapped, but Annabeth kept walking, dragging the two mages with her. He started to move like he was going to physically stop them, but John growled at him. Carl was suddenly faced with the choice of fighting right then or having his big moment for a while longer. He decided he wanted to grandstand a bit more, so he settled back and let them go. Annabeth pushed them towards the exit and then went back for the three remaining mages. This will only take a moment, she said cheerfully. Just keep talking. Don't mind us. Carl glared daggers at the departing little mages, but he didn't say a word. Just one more, Annabeth said after she made sure her charges were getting the hell out of the room. She turned towards Ken, who was staring longingly at the exit. I want you to go with Annabeth, Carl said to Ken. Ken's face lit up. I guess he thought he was going to escape too. Once you get out to the warehouse, I want you to break both her legs so she can't escape. I'm sure she will resist, so use overwhelming force and take her down quickly. Just don't kill her. Carl's face fell and his shoulders slumped. Somehow he looked even more grungy and dirty than before. I'm sure the other mages will run, so after you finish with Annabeth, hunt them down and bring them back to the warehouse. If they resist, break their legs too. Once you've gathered everyone, wait in the warehouse for me. I don't want you getting in the way of our fight down here. Do you understand? Yes, master, he said, staring at the floor. I understand. Annabeth seemed surprised to hear Ken call Carl master, but she grabbed his arm and guided him toward the exit as well. Sandy moved to go with her, but Annabeth just waved for her to stay. I got this, she said. I'll be back in a minute. Don't have too much fun while I'm gone. They left, and now it was just Tyler, John, and Sandy facing off against Carl and Marius. I'd almost forgotten about Marius, as he had been quiet and still during the whole conversation. Clearly, he didn't want to do any actual fighting. That was Carl's job. Carl, on the other hand, soaked up all the attention. He was massive. At 8.5 feet tall, he really did make John look small. I hadn't thought that was really possible. He certainly wasn't just standing there either. Instead, Carl was shifting from one foot to the other and kept rolling his shoulders. His hands clenched as he rotated his head from side to side, like how he was trying to loosen up his neck muscles. He looked like someone who'd taken way too much speed, which in a way he had. Sandy seemed to note all this and decided to stall for time. Maybe she thought Carl would do something stupid, or maybe she thought his twitching would get worse and he'd have a heart attack or something. Regardless, she got the conversation going with a question. We are here, Carl. You've obviously put a lot of thought and energy into this meeting, and this is important to you. So what do you want to say? You killed her, Carl said. It was a flat delivery, like it was the opening statement to something much more. Instead, he spazzed and twitched in silence. You killed her, he said again. This time there was anger behind it. I loved her. She loved me. The words started pouring out. I felt nothing before her. She raised me. She gave me life. I mean, I had life before, but I didn't live it. She showed me how to live. She touched me. He spasmed and twitched and gazed at them imploringly. It was like he was trying to make them understand by sheer force of will. This was a different Carl than I was used to. The Carl I'd fought a few days ago wouldn't have said anything. He would have just started the fight. Old Carl was practical and ruthless. He thought on his feet and he fought hard. This new Carl was more emotional, and it seemed like it was harder for him to think. Hopefully, Sandy could exploit that. Carl was nowhere near as crazy as the rotten mage I'd fought in the park. That guy had been a drooling idiot. Carl was headed there, though. I think he thought that storing the magic in Marius would protect him from the effects of contamination. It had certainly helped, but it hadn't protected him from everything, and he'd taken in a lot of power from rotten mages recently. He now had so much freaking magic, though. Even fighting crazy, he was still a deadly opponent. He and Marius had won the War of the Rotten Mages, which meant they'd absorbed all their power. Sure, some of it had been lost along the way, but the two of them were probably holding all the power of over 100 mages. That was a lot. She touched me, Carl's voice gained in volume. We were happy. You ruined it. You ruined all of it. He was working himself into a rage. Actually, we didn't. We didn't ruin it, John interjected, shaking his head sadly. Yes, you did, Carl hollered. You killed her. Don't deny it. I know it. I'm sure you were happy, John said softly, but I wasn't the one that ruined your circle of happiness. I think John was trying to lower the temperature of the conversation. It seemed to be working, as Carl's next response wasn't as loud. What do you mean? Who did it? I'll make them pay. You can't, John said softly. She's already gone. Who? Carl looked around like someone was going to pop out of the ground. It was Isabel, John said. She was the one that ruined your happiness. What? Carl shook his head like it hurt. What? He said again. Carl had a good thing going, John said, keeping his voice quiet. She was the head of an organization, which was something I'm sure she wanted. She had you as a close friend and lover. Life was good for both of you. You were happy. But she didn't know when to stop fighting, and she didn't know how to keep what she had. She kept pushing, even when it didn't make sense for her to do so. It was almost like she wanted someone to stop her. She didn't have to pick a fight with our house. She could have consolidated power and grown naturally. Instead, she killed one of our own and then besieged our house. She made it clear she was out to kill us, and in the end, that killed her. The thing is, even if she'd beaten us and killed every one of us, she'd have then picked a fight with someone else. Eventually, she was going to run up against somebody who could stop her. Eventually, your circle of happiness was going to fail, all because she couldn't stop. Carl growled and twitched, but he was listening. Now you're doing the same thing she did. You're picking a fight with us when you don't have to. You could walk away right now and take all that power to a different city. You could start over. Revenge isn't a long-term reason to live. You need to find something else. Now you know how to love. Go look for that again. Find a home, find a hobby, find your passion, find something that will make you happy 1,000 years from now. That's how you win. It's not by ruining others' lives or ruining your own. You already have a good friend with Marius, and you already have power. That's enough right there to build on. Work with that. You'll be much happier in the end. Carl actually looked thoughtful. Was it possible for John to talk his way out of this? Carl shifted his feet, clenched his hands, and said nothing for a long moment. You're right, he finally said. We've been kicked out before. Isabel was restless. She always wanted more. This time she died, though, and for that you will still have to pay. I've thought about you for a long time, John. It's not right that you can take from me and still be happy. It isn't right that you still have love. It isn't right that you still have friends and a home. I'm going to take that all from you. I want you to live because I want you to know what you've lost. I'm going to keep you chained in a cell, and your power is going to fuel my passion. When my dick is feeling lonely, I'm going to come to you and drain your magic until it's satisfied. When I feel nothing for life, I'm going to come to your cell and beat you until I'm happy again. I will use you to remind myself just how good I have it. I'll pop out your eyes to remind me to be grateful I can see. I'll starve you to remind me to be grateful that I have food. When no one listens to me, I'll talk to you for hours and then cut off your ears. You'll be my lover, my friend, my whipping boy, all in one. I'll never feel lonely again because I'll have you. I will become your world, and you will beg to please me. You will do all this willingly. And do you know why? Tyler and Sandy looked horrified, but John just shook his head calmly. Because I will have your little woman in a cell beside you. I will feed her, I will clothe her, I will keep her mostly healthy. All because you are a good friend. And if you are no longer my friend, I'll give her to Marius to play with. He's very creative and very good with people. I'll make you watch as he plays with her, and any pieces of her that fall off, I'll put them in your cell with you, so you can smell her flesh as it rots. His voice was gaining in volume. He was working himself into a rage again. You think you know about life? You know nothing. Carl was screaming now. You know nothing, John, nothing. You don't know what it's like to be smothered in hot tar as it burns off your flesh, or beaten because you're hungry. I just wanted to eat, John. Was that so bad? When you're hungry enough, you'll eat anything. I ate his food. Even with his blood on it, I still ate it. I ate him. I lived, John, I lived. Oh boy, he was going off the deep end and I had no idea what he's talking about. Had he really eaten someone? One day an angel came to me. She fed me and clothed me and made me whole again. She showed me her breasts and I worshipped them. I put my head on them and rested. I knew peace, John. For the first time, I felt peace. Now he was starting to get weird and biblical. Carl was sure one messed up guy. The first miners were breaking through to the passage behind the man-made wall, and Carl was now talking about all the ways he'd pleasured Isabel, so this was a perfect time to regroup and see what I could do. I popped back to my throne room to have a quick council of war. You guys know what's going on topside, I told Penny and Eggy, so the question is, how can we help? I'm not sure, Penny replied. Most of what we've planned has been for you trying to escape on your own. Now the rest of the house is here. You need to be careful not to mess them up. Indeed, Eggy agreed. They don't know you are here. So if you pop out from behind the wall, it's going to shock the hell out of them. And Carl reacts quickly in battle situations, so he'll probably take advantage of that. You're right, I said. So let's go through my list of creations and see what we can use. Flashers. I looked at them questioningly. I was pretty sure what they would say, but I still probably wasn't thinking at full capacity yet. Maybe they would surprise me. They will blind your team just as much as they'll blind Carl, Eggy said. They are useful, but only as a last resort. Ass blasters, I said. They are great workers and they shoot little pieces of rocks, but they won't hit hard enough to injure Carl, Penny said. Miners, I continued. Keep them around, Eggy replied. You still may be able to drop the ceiling on Carl and Marius. If so, you'll need all your miners to chop through the supports and drop it quickly. Granny godmothers. I can't think of any way to weaponize them, Penny said thoughtfully. Carl's going to be throwing around a lot of magic, so the air is going to get contaminated. It won't bother him, but it will still affect our crew. Maybe have them clean the air during the fight? Suck balls, I said. I'm not sure you can pull from Marius fast enough to make a difference, Eggy said. Plus, if you put enough rotten magic in the air, you're going to mess with the home team. Surfer dudes. Even as advanced as they are, I don't think they can live inside Carl's aura, Penny said, so I don't think they can crawl in his ear and mess with him that way. They are fast, though, so they might be able to throw rock chips in his eyes, Eggy suggested. Carl was back to talking about Isabel's breasts, so I took a moment and settled into my problem-solving mindset. I liked the idea of taking out his eyes, but overall there wasn't anything else I could do that wouldn't mess with Sandy and the rest of the crew. It seemed like the best thing I could do was stay out of the fight and hope they won. That didn't seem right somehow. So I'm not going to fight at all? I put the question to them. I'm not sure you can really help, Aggie said thoughtfully. You aren't in the best shape physically, so you can't fight hand to hand. Any damage you could do, John or Tyler could do so much better. As for magic, this battle is suited more for Sandy's skill set. Shouldn't we at least take care of Marius? I asked, or at least tell them to take care of him? Eggy and Penny buzzed in stone speak for a moment, and then Penny turned to me. I'm not sure taking out Marius is a good idea. He's crammed full of stolen magic. Killing him might be like shooting the gas tank of a car. In the movies, the car explodes and flies up in the air. There's fire everywhere and lots of people die. In this case, I don't think it'd be exactly like that. Aggie picked up the discussion. But he is holding in a lot of magic, and at the very least it would flood the room with rotten magic. I'm not sure Sandy and the team can fight in that kind of environment. That all made sense. I didn't like it, but it made sense. For now, I was going to sit tight and hope my team could win. Except for his eyes. I was going to take out Carl's eyes. Carl was still ranting when the miners hacked apart the last part of the stone, and I crawled out of my tunnel. I was free. For the first time in what seemed like forever, I was actually above ground. I got to my feet and almost fell over. My body had been sedated for a long time. Even with T's help, I was nowhere near fighting shape. I felt Bermuda getting restless, so I quickly sent soothing thoughts down our connection. Not now, baby, I said. You don't want to be in the middle of this fight. Just hang in there. We'll be home soon. He settled down again, but he sent me the impression that he would decide for himself when he would fight. He was the boss. I was fine with that as long as he wasn't anywhere Carl could step on him. Ass blasters, go to Penny, I commanded. I didn't want to leave any part of my power behind, and they weren't going to be any help in the upcoming battle. Miners, make a small hole in the wall, then start making stone spears. I sent out the image of a piece of stone about the size and shape of a toothpick. I had thousands of miners, so I got a pile of them pretty quickly. Dudes, grab a spear each, stick to the walls and ceiling so you won't be noticed, and get in position. When I give the signal, shoot towards Carl as fast as you can and stick them in his eyes. Then quickly get out of range. His aura will eat you alive. If you're feeling capable, grab another spear and do it again. If he throws up a personal shield, just wait for an opportunity and hit him when you can. The dudes gave me a thumbs up, grabbed a spear, and surfed through the hole in the wall. Then I had an idea. I popped out a flasher, filled him with magic, and sent him through the wall. He flew over Carl's head, turning on just enough light to give a small glow, and then started spelling out my name in the air. Marius was still looking at the ground, and Carl was into his story, so neither of them noticed anything. Tyler noticed, though, and he nudged John and whispered in his ear. Eggy was right in that bursting through the wall would let everyone know I was there. I probably shocked the hell out of my team and put them at a disadvantage at the start of the fight. A little clue like this, though, shouldn't throw off their game, and hopefully it wouldn't alert our enemy. John nodded slightly, kept his game face on, and leaned over to talk to Sandy. She'd already seen the light, though, and had started nudging John. All three of them looked at each other with concealed excitement, and I switched the flasher so it spelled out yes. It did that a few times and then flew back to me. All this is very fascinating, Sandy interrupted Carl, and I can't wait to hear more about it, but I have a quick question for you. Carl didn't seem to understand sarcasm, so he looked happy that Sandy wanted to hear more. Proceed, he instructed magnanimously. Have you seen Jason recently? She asked. You seem to know everything about us, so I'm assuming you know who that is. Ah, yes, Jason. Carl nodded. I buried him back there. He gestured towards the stone floor at the rear of the room. Sandy looked at the floor, then at John and Tyler, and then looked back at Carl in disbelief. Are you sure? She asked. The stone looks solid and the room looks normal. When Jason fights, there's usually a lot of collateral damage. I'm very sure, Carl growled. In fact, our fight is the reason I've gone this way with my magic advancement. He was much more challenging than I expected. I wanted to have the pleasure of presenting him to you as a broken slave, but that didn't work out. Instead, I buried him alive in liquid rock. It was a snap decision, so he didn't suffer the way I wanted, but at least his last few minutes were horrible. I've never been buried alive myself, but I hear it's a rotten way to go. Carl sounded miffed, like I'd personally offended him. Well, screw that. He'd personally offended me. Sandy, John, and Tyler all looked at each other in shock, but they didn't get to process it any further as Annabeth came back. She looked good, not at all like she'd just been in a big fight. She wasn't limping and her clothes weren't torn. Even her hair looked bouncy and happy. All done, she said happily, giving everyone her trademark smile. Are the Louisville mages okay? Sandy asked. Annabeth nodded. Yep, they are all safe and sound. And how is Ken doing? He's resting, Annabeth laughed. I'm sure we'll be done here before he wakes up. Annabeth, you're turning out to be a nuisance just like Jason. Carl sounded irritated now. I'm going to enjoy dealing with you. And I'm going to enjoy bringing Jason home, Sandy said. He won't be participating in the fight, of course, but it will be nice to see him again. It sounded like Sandy was cluing me into what she wanted. Stay out of the battle. Annabeth looked around confused, and Carl started shifting even more. Now she was back. There wasn't any further reason to delay the fight. There is just one more question, Carl, Sandy said sweetly, holding 2 fingers in the air. Oh, this was it. Sandy and John had talked about their battle signals before. She'd said that if possible, it was always best to begin a fight with a question. That way your opponent is hopefully thinking of the answer rather than your attack. How did you get so freaking big? She asked. She dropped a finger, leaving only one. I guess there's no harm in telling you, Carl said thoughtfully. It's not like you can do anything. Sandy dropped her last finger and Tyler attacked. He moved like the flash as he closed the distance with Carl. His batons appeared in his hand, and he was already hitting Carl almost before he had a chance to process it. He started beating on Carl's right elbow, trying to shatter it when John joined the fight. John's body was swirling in gray magic, and his fists hit like stone. He didn't get fancy. Instead, he stood in front of Carl and just hit him everywhere he could. I literally saw teeth flying, and I'm pretty sure he broke a few of Carl's ribs. A thrown stone from Sandy, about the size of a cue ball, hit him in the forehead. His head snapped back, but not before I got my damage in. Go, I commanded my 10 surfers, and they snapped into action. Their stone spears slowed them down, but not by much. They charged out of the ceiling, and the stone lances skewered Carl right through his eyes. Carl's right elbow snapped, and I felt a moment of pure relief as Tyler switched down to working on his right knee. With no sight and only one arm, surely Carl was going down. A heavy cable of power sprang up between him and Marius, and a personal shield as thick as a mattress formed around him. John and Tyler beat on his shield, but they couldn't get through. They'd already done a lot of damage, though, so hopefully that would be enough. A thick shield formed over Marius, too, but he stayed huddled in the corner, trying not to attract attention. Carl staggered back, and for a moment I thought he was going to fall over. He recovered, though, although he still looked a little addled. Everyone was still beating on his personal shield, trying to bring it down, so Carl pulled even more energy from Marius and doubled its thickness. Curiously, the one who seemed to be having the most effect was Annabeth. She was singing Freedom by George Michael. I don't belong to you, and you don't belong to me, she sang to his stolen magic, and it listened. I could see her pink magic settle onto his shield, and whole chunks of it broke off from his control. If he hadn't kept recreating it with his incredible flow, the fight would have been over. They couldn't get through, though, and I saw something that filled me with despair. The stone spears were coming back out of his eyes. Crap. Carl was not only defending himself, he was healing too. Mages normally can't heal themselves anywhere near as fast, but he'd grown 1.5 feet in a few hours, so I guess normal rules didn't apply to him. Carl's body ejected all the stone spears, and his eyes grew back into place. The skin on his right elbow wiggled and shifted a bit. Then he flexed his arm a few times, testing his new joint. It seemed to work well. His chest looked odd where John had punched him, but that shifted next, and soon everything looked normal. He even took the time to regrow his teeth. While he was doing this, my crew stepped up their attacks. Sandy threw heavier rocks to see if that could make a difference, and one of them even bounced off Carl and smacked into Marius. Even as a ricochet, it still had plenty of power and hit Marius' shield with a solid boom. Marius decided his corner was a bit too dangerous, so he quickly moved up the wall until he was beside the folded cots. Then he'd huddled by the wall again and tried to disappear. It would be a very unusual ricochet that hit him now. Tyler tried to seduce Carl, which was a great idea, but his magic quickly withdrew when it touched Carl's rotten aura. It probably felt like trying to be sexy with an overflowing toilet. Ugh. Carl flexed a bit, testing his regenerated body, and then he favored everyone with a big smile. Well, that was certainly invigorating. I commend you on your surprise attack. Now it's my turn. His smile turned vicious as he gestured at Tyler, forming a huge ball of magic around him. Tyler could dodge and move, but it wouldn't do him much good. This ball was much bigger than him, so there was nowhere to escape to. I've learned all I can about each of you, Carl said, as he clenched his hand and the bubbles shrank. When it touched Tyler, it stuck to him, and soon he was wrapped in Carl's magic, like he'd been encased in shrink wrap. You're all good fighters, of course, but you have your weaknesses too. Carl gestured and Tyler lifted into the air. In your case, you're a pesky little bastard on the ground. But once you're in the air, you're pretty harmless. He moved Tyler so he was now between him and John. John tried to get around, but Carl just moved Tyler so he stayed between them. You had fun hitting me. Now it's time for me to return the favor. Carl grabbed Tyler with a thick rope of power and slammed him against the ceiling. Then he slammed him against the floor. Then he slammed him against John. John backed up, trying not to do any damage to Tyler, but Carl just kept pulling Tyler back to get some momentum and hurling him at John again. Carl continued to batter John with Tyler's body, and John continued trying to dodge the attacks. John wasn't a skillful dodger, though, and many times they just smashed together. Carl was certainly having fun, but that wasn't his real plan, as we quickly found out. As soon as John moved back and out of the way, Carl sprinted towards Sandy and grabbed her by her hair. I wouldn't have thought a guy that big could move that fast, but he grabbed her and ran back to his side of the room before anyone could react. Sandy's default reflex was to struggle and pull back, but Carl was huge and momentum was on his side. She barely had time to scream before he threw her into the sucker circle and flooded it with magic to turn it on. Oh shit. Does this feel familiar, Sandy? He leered at her. Your weakness is you're nothing without your magic. Sandy screamed and began beating on the walls. Don't worry, I won't kill you, he commanded. He continued. By the time I let you out, you'll be a good girl. You'll learn to obey, and if you learn that well enough, I'll let you have some playtime with Marius. You'll like that. He laughed again. Holy crap, this battle had really gone to shit. John roared, slapping both hands on the stone floor, and started transforming into his golem form. This was new. When I'd seen him go golem before, he needed to eat rocks to start his transformation. Now it looked like he just needed to touch it. That was certainly faster and easier. Carl put his hand on the wall of the sucker circle and activated his sucker tattoo and took a big pull. I didn't see any magic leaving the circle, and based on Carl's frustrated look, it didn't look like anything happened. Sandy had gotten over her surprise, and now she stood firm in the circle. Her stance was wide and powerful. She exuded determination and stubbornness. If Carl was going to take her magic, he was going to have to work for it. Carl grunted and pulled, but Sandy wasn't having it. I realized this was the first time Carl had really had anyone resist him. Ken's students, had all been oath-bound, and there wasn't any real resistance there. The Rotten Mages had all been a little crazy, and Carl's 6 tattoos beat their 1 tattoo, so they hadn't been able to put up any real resistance to him. As for Sandy, the last time she'd been in a sucker circle, she'd been unconscious. This time she was awake and ready to show Carl what a strong-willed woman could do. John finished his transformation, and now, at 9 feet tall, he was bigger than Carl. With all that rock, he massively outweighed Carl, too. Ah, the golem. Carl didn't seem worried. John roared and charged, and Carl froze him solid. John froze so fast he didn't even get a chance to finish his stride. He hit the ground hard and slid a few feet. Cold is your weakness, Carl said smugly, and you know what happens to stone when it gets really cold? It gets brittle. Carl's link with Marius grew thicker as he sucked in even more magic. Then he spent a moment freezing John even more. John quickly became covered in frost. Then his frost became frosted. Soon he looked like a bag of food that had been left in the freezer for years. Carl wrapped him in magic and picked him up, although it wasn't easy. Carl started panting and almost fell to his knees. Then with a powerful grunt, he threw John as hard as he could. John hit the wall by the entrance with a resounding crack and shattered into thousands of pieces. No, Sandy screamed as she looked at the pieces of John in despair. Then she went beyond determined. She became angry. The interior of the sucker room filled with fire, and Sandy started turning the floor to lava. She was an ambassador of the deep earth and a fire mage. The rocky floor was hers to command. The floor also held the sucker rune and all of its connections. This was Carl's domain, and he wasn't going to let it go without a fight. He flooded the sucker circle with his magic and attempted to keep control. Annabeth was playing a supporting role, but that didn't mean she was idle. She was already scooping up John's stones and putting them in a pile. I looked for John's human form, but didn't see it. The last time Don had changed to a golem, his physical body had actually been encased by the stone. Once we'd been able to get all the rock off of him, he'd gone back to his regular fleshy self. This time, it looked like he'd fully converted to stone. I wasn't sure if that was good or bad. Annabeth was also singing Chain of Fools. Annabeth was also singing Chain of Fools, and this time she was targeting Tyler. Carl was so focused on Sandy that he'd left Tyler just dangling in the air. Her pink magic settled on the shrink wrap of rotten magic around Tyler and started peeling it away. As soon as Tyler got a bit of freedom, his hands changed to claws and he started shredding the magic himself. His nails were long, sharp, and filled with the sky blue color. His batons were supposed to be the best at breaking shields, but based on how fast he was shredding Carl's control over him, I think his claws were better. Carl added more power to his hold over Tyler, but he was too distracted to really fight for control, and it wasn't long before Tyler and Annabeth won. Tyler ripped off the last of Carl's magic and dropped to the ground. Then he sprinted around Carl and ran to the far side of the sucker circle. He began slashing at the walls of the sucker circle, trying to shred its magic. Annabeth switched her focus to the sucker circle too. Now she was singing about Jonah and the Battle of Jericho. except she switched out Sandy for Jonah, and she just mainly focused on the lyrics, and the walls came tumbling down. Carl fought back the three of them, and for a long moment it looked like he was going to win. This was a battle of focus, though, and Carl was affected by all the magic he'd stolen. Even in the middle of the fight, he was still twitching. Sandy's power really won the day, though. Every time his attention wavered, even if it was for a moment, her lava ate a bit more of his rune. There wasn't any way for him to get his lines back, so the outcome was already predetermined. It seemed to take forever, and Carl fought to the bitter end, but finally the wall of the sucker circle collapsed. Tyler grabbed Sandy and sprinted back towards their side of the room. Sandy let him carry her as she summoned a bunch of the rocks she'd thrown. She put them right up against Carl's shield, and then she burned them. The heat in the room quickly climbed to unbearable levels. Even behind my man-made wall, I felt like I was standing in front of an open oven. Marius squealed in fear, and Carl roared in pain as he smothered the rocks with his magic and wrenched them out of her control. Carl threw up walls of force, blocking Sandy and her crew from throwing anything more at him. He looked horrible. His skin bubbled and started falling off of him. The smell of cooked meat filled the air. How he stayed on his feet, I don't know, but he was still alive, still capable of processing magic. His link with Marius became even wider, and his body started repairing itself at a rapid rate. This guy could just not die. This guy just would not die. Tyler set Sandy on the ground, but her eyes looked wild. She was ready to take down Carl's walls and keep going, but then she stopped and looked around like she'd heard something. Carl hadn't been the only one affected by all that heat. John's rock started shifting, and his golem form rebuilt itself. It wasn't long before John was whole again. The first thing he did was pick Sandy up and give her a big hug. He did it gently as he didn't want to crush her, but the love was certainly there. Sandy kissed his rocky lips and hugged him back. It was a beautiful moment in the middle of a nasty battle. It was more than just the battle that was nasty. All that rotten magic in the air was starting to turn it acidic. Every time Carl used his magic, and so far that had been a lot, the putrid power stayed in the air. The underground room was barely big enough to fight in, much less hold this much power. The magic was angry and it wanted to tear down everything it touched. That could be skin, stone, or even other magic. I looked closer and I could see it was already breaking down Carl's walls. It wasn't a huge amount, but the more magic Carl used, the harder it was going to be to fight in this place. John kissed Sandy back, his big rocky lips covering half her face. Then he put her down on the ground again. Then they looked at Carl. He wasn't fully recovered yet, and he was starting to look a little less human. The skin that had grown back was gray in color, and it looked thick and rubbery. His forehead was bigger, and it was growing out over his eyes to give them more protection from blows. His nose had changed, and now it was a solid sheet of bone with 2 holes in it. Even his teeth had retreated into his face to get more protection. The changes didn't stop at his head either. His shoulders were wider to give him more physical power, and his arms were longer to give him more reach. John didn't look impressed. "Keep me warm, love," he said to Sandy, and then he roared and charged. And that ends our chapter. Next week is great. I am so looking forward to sharing the next chapter with you. All right. Have a wonderful week, and I will see you soon.